completely on just living here. But I feel very fortunate to have kind of arrived with this group. It was, I call it kismet. It was serendipitous in some way. My advisor, my co-advisor is Laura Bronstein, as you had mentioned, and she, as well as my other advisor, Liz Mellon, have really helped me ground my research in both social capital theory and network theory. I'm going to talk a little bit about my research today and try to bring it into the context of teacher education. But my context is very different in the US than it is here. And I'm just slowly kind of getting a handle on how different our contexts are. So if something doesn't make sense, please stop me. But if you can also just try to superimpose some of what I'm talking about onto your context, that might help you kind of stretch your imagination as to how social network theory and how social capital can help you as collaborators. Just a little bit about me. I'm a clinical mental health counselor, and working in mental health really introduced me to all of the systemic problems of really reaching especially young people. And instead of going for my doctorate in mental health counseling, I chose to really study public affairs instead, because I felt like in the United States context I could make much more of a difference from kind of the network of how we're doing mental health counseling with young people. So I'm grounded as a practitioner and trying to make the differences and changes in the United States through policy change and kind of the bigger macro system in the US. My research themes are social capital, interprofessional collaboration, school mental health, ecological systems theory, and my dissertation is completely focused on a network analysis of what we call care teams in the US. They're teams of people who work together interprofessionally. They're psychologists, teachers, social workers, who focus on children who are falling through the cracks, as we say, who are slipping through the system. And these teams work together to get them to the resources that they need. That works sometimes and it doesn't work other times, and so I'm trying to understand, well, why is it working in some contexts instead of others? And that's where social capital and network theory are really guiding my research. There's no way I'm going to fit this all into our time period. So if we get to both activities, that will be wonderful, but we'll do our best. How many people are aware of social capital theory in their work? Aware? Okay, aware, okay. Okay, that's good. So these won't be completely new concepts. So for the first hour, I'm going to try to synthesize social capital theory and network theories, and then we'll look a little bit more deeply at network theory, but keep it somewhat as a surface level. The activity that I've planned is very tactile. I'm going to have you draw your networks, and we use sophisticated software to analyze network theories, but it's all really based on relationships, which you can actually just draw. And so I'm hoping that that will help illuminate this for you. So why do we collaborate as educators? In the US context, we are really faced with issues of resource allocation and misallocation and unequal distribution of resources. Poverty is a huge problem in the United States. Students have access to very different quality of education depending on where they grew up. They can simply be born in the wrong neighborhood, and that can affect the type of education and the quality that they're going to get. And a lot of those complex social problems result in non-academic barriers to learning. They have nothing to do with how smart the child are. They have to do with what opportunities they've had. And so we call that a gap. And what we've seen is that students who have more access to resources excel, and students who have less access don't do as well. And so we also see that this results in behavioral issues that can be based on anything, including gender. Boys, particularly boys of color, black boys, tend to be treated differently than girls in our system. And disability status too. If a child is not, if nobody knows how to take care of that child or doesn't know how to recognize an issue, that can completely impact how they're cared for in their schools. So these care teams that I'm researching are trying to target those students, find them, and connect them with systems. So what this means is that we have social workers, psychologists, counselors, educators working together. Very different backgrounds, some overlaps in training, and also some hierarchical differences in expertise or ideas of where they belong in the hierarchy of expertise. So this can create a lot of sometimes drama when people get together and work, but it can also just mean inefficiency in how people work together. So collaboration can be very difficult, and that's what we're seeing in the US. In the Dutch education system, I don't really know enough about you yet to really understand why you collaborate here. I'm aware of this theme that I cannot pronounce, this youth care transformation that happened last year. And Jacqueline has made me aware of this idea of the teacher as a networker. And that is something that we really don't talk about in the United States at all, this idea that the teacher is more than just the classroom instructor. That's slowly starting to change, but that would be kind of a radical idea in the United States, this idea of the networked teacher. So it's very exciting to hear about that idea here, and I'm interested in how that works and what that looks like, particularly for you as teacher educators. How do you instruct your students? How do you teach that? How do you make that happen? So some of what I want to talk about today are just how aware of teachers are they of their own networks? How aware are teachers of their students' networks? And who will the networked teacher collaborate and connect with? And then also it's hard to ignore current demographic shifts in Europe. As an outsider, it's fascinating to watch this. And I think that it is something that people are really just learning how to talk about at all, and how that will impact teacher education in the future. And this is surely to affect how teachers as networkers learn how to interact with different cultural systems, groups, families, moving forward as the network teachers. So the reason that social capital and social network theories are just really nice to synthesize together are that relationship is totally at the heart of what these theories are about. They're about building relationships across the schools, within the schools, professional training, social status, and power. So not only do these theories recognize that relationship is both interpersonal, but it's also interorganizational, and it's also system-wide. So how schools relate to government, how schools relate to agencies, how individuals relate to the schools. These are all relationships. And those relationships are built on personality, types of influence that we have over each other, our informal and formal communication. So what we have to do, the meetings that we attend, this kind of formal type of communication, but then what happens afterwards when we all split off into our groups and maybe some of us go have a coffee somewhere and talk a little bit more about this, and some people go home. There's a lot of knowledge exchange in those interactions, both formally and informally. And they're all based on human interaction. But it's very hard to study because these are real world issues, right? So classrooms, we can't really create control groups and that are perfectly controlled. Classrooms are built on all sorts of behaviors. There could be a fire alarm and class has to stop right in the middle. There's kind of this very immediate situation that happens in schools. And so in practice, directives to work together are not always successful. We can kind of wax on and on about how wonderful collaboration is, but it's hard work. And putting the theory into practice really depends on the function of those human interactions and all of the nuances. Social network and capital theories are predicated on the view that relationships between people and their individual positions, so I saw positionality as a theme in some of the slides before, are critical to the overall performance of the networks. The idea is that the more networked individuals are within a collaboration, so the more knowledge that's exchanged directly between people, the more opportunity there is to learn, grow, create, practice, and then mobilize into action whenever that time comes. And that could be a curriculum development and implementation, that could be a research, that could be the article that is produced, whatever it is that the collaboration about is that next step. And embedded in these relationships are patterns that manifest as pathways that can be mapped with social network analysis. So that's really the beautiful combination of the two, that there are relationships and then we can look directly at the patterns of how those relationships look. So the web of relationships, I like to think that they can constrain or provide opportunity. So it might be that in a collaboration group, two people get along very well and exchange a lot of information and maybe get together on a group and have a really successful project happen. But two people might not get along either, or maybe somebody is having transportation issues and misses a meeting and is just a little bit behind. And so that can also constrain opportunities. It doesn't always have to be bad. Sometimes people are not socially adept necessarily at sharing collaboration space, maybe can share ideas but don't necessarily do as well collaborating directly with people. There are some researchers that do best just researching and just creating theory. So not everybody has to be involved directly every day, but understanding what roles people play in collaboration and how to harness the strengths of the people in the collaboration can really do a lot for understanding how people are sharing knowledge. Social network analysis and social capital theories can help us look at the relationships between people, groups, institutions, and systems. And there's an assumption that in most cases, those who do share knowledges and resources will cooperate and accomplish and share more than if they were to work in isolation, which is common sense on many levels, but at the practical level, sometimes we forget that. It's not always easy to get out and do something extra that might even be outside of your normal job description. And I know that for teachers, that's often in the US, they feel very overburdened and taxed. Like every year there's something new, some new thing, some new mandate that's placed upon them. And it's tiresome and they want to get paid for the work that they're doing and things like that. Those are real world issues. And so the mandate can be there, but it doesn't always work. The other great thing about these theories is that they're also flexible. They recognize human conditions. They recognize that that we don't operate in vacuums, that life happens, and those become a part of the collaboration. So educational researchers are using these theories more and more, and it's really focused the research on the real work, the real life context of collaboration. So there are different dimensions of social capital, and there's a lot written on this, and if you dive deep into their literature, you can read one author and they describe social capital one way, another author will talk about it differently. They overlap in that these are relationships. But I've kind of compiled some of the main dimensions for you, and this is going to be kind of what our activity is about. So our internal social capital is manifested within a collaboration group. So this is the quality and value of the relationship that is within a bounded group, where the shared information, accountability, personal relationships stay within that group. But people are not isolated. So we also take those conversations that we've had in that group, and I might go home and talk with a colleague who's not part of that group, and she might give me an idea that then I take back to that group. And so my external capital has impacted the internal social capital of my group, if that makes sense. So the internal social capital becomes subject to the relationships of individuals in the group. There are some studies that are looking at the strength of social capital, if there is both strong internal and strong external social capital, to determine whether or not those collaboration groups do better, do more work. And so internal, external social capital, how the internal social capital of the group is subject to the connections that each individual members have. This is closely related to the idea of bonding social capital. And there's bonding, bridging, and linking social capital, and I'm going to go through them. Bonding is what happens very naturally between people. Teachers tend to have lunch with teachers. Educators tend to have lunch with educators. I assume many of you have very similar backgrounds, and that's quite typical, that we would hang out. It's kind of likes like. And it's not necessarily a weakness, it's a natural thing. However, these relationships can end up being very exclusive and can keep information and knowledge exchange siloed. Is that a word that you use here, siloed? So we have grain silos. Silos? Okay, yes. So siloed information, where your discipline is your hierarchical structure, your discipline is all of your knowledge generation, your discipline is really all that you share and grow and what you're about. But like I said, this can be exclusive, and it can also restrict knowledge and resource flow. At the same time, it can help you develop very strong professional identities, which is very important. It's important for our teachers and our counselors and our psychologists and social workers to know who they are and where they came from, and to know their body of expertise. But at the same time, we can't know everything. It's very important to share and understand and learn from other professions. So bonding social capital is what happens when there's a little bit of restricted flow of knowledge, but there is knowledge flowing, of course. It's just all bound in the same system.
Can you explain the word turf issue?
Turf issues, yes. So in collaboration, particularly interprofessional collaboration, is that interprofessional? Okay. For me as a counselor, sitting in a collaboration with a teacher, we may have very different ideas of what is important to focus on with the student. The teacher might have a mandate that is focused on attendance and behavior, whereas I might be much more focused on the social and wellness growth of the child and any kind of behavioral issues. I'm going to want to look at the solutions. The teacher is going to want the student in class. This is, of course, in the U.S. context. So my knowledge, I might privilege my knowledge, okay? I might look at my knowledge as more important than the teacher's knowledge. And the teacher might look at her knowledge as more important than mine. And so that's where we can have some turf issues, like my territory actually is more important than your territory. And this can be difficult. This can be difficult in professional settings. So, and what can happen is conflict, obviously, but there can also be growth in that conflict and kind of trying to figure out, well, how do our resources and knowledge, how do they overlap, and how can we transform what we both know into something different? And so while the bonding social capital is important for knowing who you are, then you can develop into this idea of bridging social capital where then we combine what we know. So that's the next step. So this question that I wanted to pose is, what's happening with the teachers that you're educating? What's happening amongst yourselves as researchers, as educators? Is your knowledge production, is your expertise, are you exchanging in ways that are closed to your own disciplinary group? And what does that look like for you? And what does this mean for the network teacher of the future? So the next level of social capital is bridging social capital, and this is that idea of boundary crossing that I saw some references to. And this is kind of that preliminary boundary crossing where the expertise are shared. They might be shared, though, from professional to professional. So it might be that our hierarchies, where we are in our hierarchy of our system, we're still sharing at that same level. But we're creating new knowledge, we're creating theory to practice. This can be a very inclusive thing. This is where a lot of professionals reside, is in this area, especially in departments that really emphasize interprofessional collaboration. So these are heterogeneous professions, connecting new ways of thinking and ideas. Often the roles are well defined. I know I'm a counselor, I know somebody's a teacher, but we have a lot of respect for each other, and we get each other's perspective, and then create something new and a solution. And this is what helps move information through knowledge systems. So you might start seeing a chapter, this happened in counseling, in relationship to psychology in the United States. Counseling was very concerned with multicultural issues in counseling, and it started shaping how psychologists were writing about multicultural issues in psychology. And so that was a nice bridging. And so the question is, do teachers initiate and sustain good networks of practice and knowledge exchange that bridges to other disciplines to solve problems? And what does this look like for the network teacher? And then linking social capital, which is perhaps the most complex of all of these dimensions. Linking social capital is what starts bridging us across systems of power. And I know Ans would be very interested in this. Linking social capital is what happens when we start talking to families. Families become involved with our collaborations. In the US, this is very important because often the families that we're targeting the students of are marginalized families. And so they might be people who would be very intimidated to talk to a professional. They might be somebody who didn't finish school themselves. And so there can be preconceptions about who they are and why they might not be participating in their child's education. Those preconceptions are often not correct. But because people haven't talked to each other, we don't know. There was a common misconception that parents of poor students or poor parents were not showing up to meetings because they didn't care. After some research on this particular group of parents, they realized that the bus didn't actually go all the way to their neighborhood. And so they couldn't actually get to the meetings. And that was very important to understand. So building those linking social capital is extremely important. Now this is also very important from an education or from a academic standpoint in knowledge production. Our bachelor's levels, master's levels, and PhD level professors and students working together is their actual knowledge exchange. How is our organizations embracing the attitudes and values of people from different classes, different ethnicities, different backgrounds and training. This one can be a little more abstract, but to me it's critical. So the question is, are teachers in their networks operating holistically at all levels? In leadership, management, practices, training, resources? Are the links appropriately reciprocal and aimed towards a common goal? This is very important. So if my expectation is that a parent has to come to a meeting at 3 o'clock in the afternoon because that's when I'm at school, that's not very fair to somebody who might be at work at that time. So then that's not a reciprocal aim. So trying to really understand, like, where is that other person coming from? That's the linking. And so what does this mean for the network teacher? Any questions so far? Okay, we're doing it. So then, there are also relational, cognitive, and structural aspects of social capital. So the relational dimension, you'll see that themes overlap, okay? But this is developed in the day-to-day doing of our work, right? So this is just when we come to work every day. We're having interactions, we're relating to each other. This is the teaching theory to practice. This is the practical end of all of the things that we do. The cognitive dimension is more of the shared meaning, the codes, the narratives, and this can be tricky amongst interprofessional collaborations because as somebody who's looking at behaviors, I may write a report that looks very different about a student than a teacher would write. We might use completely different terms. I might use diagnostic terms. I might refer to the DSM, which I don't do actually. I don't believe in the DSM, but I might use very, very different language than a teacher might use, or that a psychologist might use, or a social worker might use. And so are we sharing languages and codes, narratives, and when we have a mismatch of those codes, are we trying to bridge them? So that's the cognitive dimension of social capital. And then the structural dimension is where this idea of the network is really residing. And this is kind of this idea of who you teach and how you reach them. All right, this is like if I go through my day and I'm not actively trying to interact with people, I may never interact with anybody. If I call myself a collaborator, but I'm not really doing much more than what I do every day, I'm not really collaborating. However, I also might be working in a very rural place where it's difficult to collaborate with people. And so my network is more limited. My ability to do my work, to get to the people that I need to associate with, can also be limited by proximity, by knowledge, by training. I might not be allowed as a master's degree student to attend a meeting of doctorate level practitioners. So this structural dimension is very important. It's very much about, it's kind of that who you know idea. Very abstract, but at the same time very important because this is what facilitates and gets in the way of how we share information. So these are embedded systems. I have a figure next, so that's going to help kind of visualize this. They span from individual to the professional level all the way to policy and governance. And they also fit into this idea of the ecological systems theory. This can be kind of superimposed on these ideas of the dimensions of social capital. The micro level being, for me as the teacher, the knowledge and skills that I need to do my job, as well as the connections between individuals and others. The meso level is going to be more about the interactions that I make in my job daily, who I'm working with. This would be at the meso level. And then the macro level, which are the bigger social patterns, the policy, the socioeconomic issues. Some of our conversation that we had earlier just about the differences in the educational foundational theories are very different in the Dutch system than in the US system. So the macro level here is going to look very different than the macro level in the United States. So this can be looked at kind of cohesively. And it's also very hard. I was thinking I needed a 3D printer for my brain. Because these ideas also are not separate. They're all interjoined, just as all of the levels of Brockenbrenner's ecological systems theory. You know, nothing is isolated. And so you might have very bonded social relationships within your research group, but you might bridge in other areas of the work that you do. And the same with linking. You might do a lot of volunteer work. Maybe that's something that's very important to you, but perhaps it's important to you through participation in a religious organization, but not necessarily a professional organization. So these ideas do not have to be so isolated. I'm isolating them, though, on your professional expertise and knowledge sharing. So in a structural network, that's kind of this big macro area, the bonding social capital is going to be where the teachers have the close connections, they get by with each other, right? This is when we're just lunching together. As you move through to the bridging, the network level is going to look more like the teachers have broad connections in their community. Those broad connections help them expand their networks. The linking takes it a next step further in the network level, where teachers have connections to organizations and systems up and down hierarchies that help them gain resources and give resources and become network teachers. These are very much connected to this idea of trust, right? When we have relationships, there's a certain amount of trust or distrust between our relationships, between how we exchange information. I might not know somebody very well, and so I might be less inclined to work with them. That tends to be the opposite for me, actually. I like working with people that I don't know, but it can be uncomfortable. So moving out into the cognitive, the norms, what are the norms of your profession, and then the structural networks. I'll make this available to you so that everyone can see it and have it. Okay, thank you. So if you could pass that around. Thank you. I created, it's just a very brief primer on social capital and network theories, okay? So if you're interested, read this. If you're not, recycle it. But I've included in that, and this is part of your exercise, this chart, okay? So this is trying to bring it all together. And there's one, I believe, on the back page of that. So there should be two handouts. Yeah, okay, so one's the activity and then one is, yeah, okay. So you're going to have one chart that's blank and then you're going to have this chart to kind of follow along with. So this is a little jargony, and I apologize for that. Do you have that? Is jargon a word here? Jargon is, yes. So, yeah, it's a little bit specific. A lot of social capital research comes out of organizational research, and so there's a lot of that kind of management and business kind of terminology. But this is the basic idea. And this idea, Jacqueline had asked me to talk about this idea of privileging and what that means. Privileging, from an American perspective, means that I'm emphasizing the connection. I am giving it more importance than any of my other connections. So I'm giving that connection a privilege of my attention. Do you have a word for that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Priority.
Yeah, priority. I'm giving it priority. But there's a value in it too. It's priority, and it's also, I've elevated it in my mind too. I feel that it is the most important. Okay, so as a counselor, I feel that my counseling theory is the only theory. And that's the most important theory. And I'm only going to do research. I'm only going to interact from that theoretical standpoint. And I really don't want to talk to other practitioners. I don't really care about, I don't care about what you teachers think, right? Okay, that's kind of that really bonded micro level. Now I can bridge that out at the micro level and build knowledge ties to other networks and other professions. And then I can also link to leaders and hierarchies, right? So you can kind of see how this expands in bonding, bridging, and linking into this more networked idea of what I do with my expertise. Because the further I go out from myself, the more I share, the larger my network is going to be. And that network is not just who I know, it's also what I know. So the more people I interact with, the more pathways of knowledge sharing can actually manifest. So the way to read this, and this isn't like this is the bad corner and that's the good corner, okay? It's just you might find yourself in any of these areas. You will probably locate yourself somewhere around here in more of the meso-micro area, maybe more bonded than bridged, and some of you may be more linked than others. And it's all about what you do, what your values are, who your relationships are, and what you're prioritizing and what you're also privileging. So, as you're looking at this, are people able to kind of locate themselves in your own work as teacher educators on this, or is it too abstract? Yeah.
Nee.
Yes.
Why is the word exclusive by bonding? Because I should think about inclusive.
Yes, so it's exclusive, meaning that it excludes other perspectives. And the bonding social capital is that idea that all of my knowledge is within one discipline. So
Is that the
it's that siloed, exactly. So while there's still sharing, that sharing can still happen on the macro level, it might only be amongst educators and educational institution, curriculum developer. I don't know how your government works, if you have a Department of Education here in the same way that we do, but it could be that it is totally top-down, right? So that education department is made up only of educators, and so knowledge is really shared at the network level, still within that siloed. When you get to the macro level, that's a little bit more rare, but it happens. It certainly happens that agencies don't connect. We have that all the time in the United States. I don't know how that works so much here. What other questions jump out? Are you, as you try to find yourself in this? Where would the research group, where would the research group be on this chart? Bridging? Are there different trainings and backgrounds in the research group?
Not a lot. No, well, we have Ellen den Arendt from the municipality. That was one of the reasons to add another perspective into the research group. That was, and is that then? Is that? Yeah. Are you then?
Governance and
Is it then macro?
It's
It's still meso.
It's still meso-micro because it's at a practical level.
Yeah.
However, the knowledge and expertise did come from the more macro perspective and that's a good example of building social capital, bridging it, and then transforming it into something like the research group.
Yeah.
Now
also the workouts we organized. The aim was to learn from other professions and other organizations.
Yes.
Where would it be then?
That would still really be in the meso level. Yeah. Most of the work that all of us do is going to be in the micro and meso level until we start looking at how we're affecting policy and education. The student-centered change that happened in 2015, that's a meso level change. And I don't know enough about it to understand how the agencies and cooperated or didn't cooperate to make that happen, but that's a macro level change, more of a systemic change. That would be a linking change if in the research behind making that change, they had, I'm talking about them as they, maybe some of you in the room were part of that, I have no idea, But if they had taken perspectives of all of the people involved with that, okay, in that change, if they had actually talked to students, teachers, teacher educators, counselors, psychologists, why, social workers, as to why and how it would be implemented, that would be a macro level linking kind of network level change, if that makes sense. It's difficult to talk about the idea of trust because it can be a word with a lot of value added, right? So trust in this sense can also relate to distrust. So how do we exclude at that level? At the relational level, we can create blocks in our knowledge exchange simply by just not inviting somebody to collaborate, right? And we could completely lose a perspective. And that can be for any number of reasons. It doesn't have to be personal, yes.
Also, when you're not interchange, when you're not communicate subject, you don't bring it in subject.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly, yes. If there's a...
You can communicate, but you choose your subjects. Not all the subjects are discussed.
Yes, exactly.
You can repeat.
Yeah, so if I'm understanding correctly, if you decide what you're bringing to your collaboration, if you decide to focus on one thing and not another, that becomes an exclusive relationship. We also have to make choices too, right, to get work done. So there's an aspect of this too that everybody can't always be at the table. Every idea can't always be discussed just because for practical reasons. But how we make those decisions together, how we come to those conclusions, and then how we take the next steps to then either be more inclusive the next time or not becomes part of how we build social capital.
Can we try to locate the beroepsproduct in this scheme? Because our students, they have to, for their assignments, they have to develop or write what we call professional products.
Yes.
And we have 3 levels. The micro level within their own normal professional practice, if I say it rightly. Then the meso level, then they have to expand a bit.
Also micro.
Among colleagues, and then further where they have to go outside their own organization.
Sure.
And is that, because that's rather new.
Okay.
We have started with that this year, so
When the student, future teacher, when the future teacher is
they are teachers already.
They are teachers already.
Yes.
So when they're expected to make more connections in their community, what does that mean?
It could be a subject.
Yes.
They can choose their subject for this product.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when I'm concepting it right, it could be when they have the subject collaboration.
Mm-hmm.
They want to explore collaboration in their organization. They could use this kind of model.
Mm-hmm.
And explore it, and it could be micro, meso, or macro. Macro there for them is not in range, I think.
Mm-hmm.
It's more political, governance,
Sure.
Systems on a higher level,
Yep.
I'm assuming.
Yes.
So I think for our students it could be a model to think about their subject, what they want to choose, how to improve collaboration.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly, I think, the way to think about it is because there might be value in staying. There might be value in staying here as maybe a first-year teacher. right?
To explore your own expertise.
To
for
explore your own
example.
expertise.
That might be very
Yes.
interesting.
And to develop them and really understand theory, right? Sometimes we do, for me as a counselor, it was very important to completely understand what cognitive behavioral therapy meant, right? But as you develop a little bit more, bridging to other areas can be very important. But this can also depend on the subject that they're teaching too. They might be teaching a subject that is maybe really useful to have other perspectives in teaching it, right? So if there's, like, I'm thinking of an example, and this may not work at all, but I'm thinking of a science teacher who maybe doesn't have the expertise to talk about neurodevelopment or something like that, and so makes a connection, invites somebody into the classroom, or does more educational development on their own, and creates more pathways to knowledge sharing than they had just from their subject learning, right? Just from what they learned in their own background. What else do they do with that product? What you were talking about. So they develop that.
For example, a product could be, because the subjects they write about are more general, because students, for example, they do a product about how to collaborate with parents.
Sure.
For example.
Okay.
That could be, and then they could develop a model for their school, how they could best work with parents.
That's a really good example, because the parents are outside of the system, right? They're not educators. They might be, but they're not they're not teaching at the school. And so in order to make that connection, they have to bridge out of what they're doing every single day. And also, depending on the culture, knowledge of that family member, they might also have to learn a little bit more. It's possible that parent doesn't speak Dutch, right? That's more and more common, right? In one of the schools studying in the United States, there are 69, this is a school of 400 students, and there are 69 different languages spoken and by these students who are now English language learners, right? What that means is that their parents don't speak English, and there are 69 different languages that they're bringing to parent-teacher conferences and whatnot. So linking to that family to try to figure out, well, how do we talk with this family is a really important thing. So yes, I think that it could be useful in those settings. Time? I hear somebody, something's beeping. But yeah, so we kind of did the exercise together, but what you can do to kind of take this home with you and think about it in your teaching is on the exercise, there's a blank side. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. And so what I had wanted you to do is just put an X where you think you are right now in your professional development as a social capital builder, where you think you are now. And to put a triangle, the change symbol, as to where you would like to be, all right? And just to think about why that is, what that means for you. You might not want to change at all, but just what that means for you. That was kind of the activity. We kind of did it together. But go ahead and take a coffee break. And then we'll come back in about 10, 15 minutes, and then talk a little bit more about the network analysis piece of this, okay? Thank you. Use this activity with your own students and with yourself and with your own research and collaborations. Most people can really relate to the bonding and bridging types. The linking types are a little bit more challenging to do, and also some of the most rewarding work that can happen. But as you use this, most students are going to really relate to the bonding and bridging. And also, our daily activities really keep us, just by proximity, bounded in those internal relationships, the relational and cognitive areas, and the micro and more meta dimensions of social capital. So the macro, the linking, the systems perspective are going to be a little bit more abstract and a little bit less common. But they are, in my mind, something to really reach for if that's the idea of what the network teacher is. It can be really useful to take this wide lens view of social capital and try to really superimpose it on the work that you do, just to help you think about yourself as an interprofessional collaborator. Oftentimes when we teach this stuff, we can be very removed from what we're teaching. And so how are we acting also as collaborators? Where are we in this bonding, bridging, and linking paradigm? Are we networked teacher educators? So just some questions to consider. We don't really have time to talk about them too much as a group, but is becoming a network teacher something that is active or is it passive? Is it something that you make time for or does it just happen? How does interprofessional collaboration impact the work that you do as an educator, as a researcher, and perhaps, if you're so inclined, as also a policymaker? And then is the development of social capital always positive? Why or why not? And so those are questions to consider. Social capital, I actually have to take a break and say that because social capital can be a negative development when in the United States context, I think drug culture is a very good example of when social capital can have a bad consequences because those bonds can be very strong in a neighborhood. They can be very well developed as well. You can have families born into and sustaining addiction, drug sales, dependence, and that's also social capital. So that can be a negative example. So there's just different ways to think about it. That was the activity. So moving into social network theory, and I don't want to rush through this, but I want to get through it so that you have time for this activity. Social network theory is a theory, but it also is a methodology, which makes it kind of exciting and very dynamic. And some of you, I think, have sat in on workshops with Henderine. And it enriches how social capital theory is able to describe relationships. Social capital theory can be theoretical. It can be kind of abstract. Network analysis helps ground it so that we can actually see what those relationships look like. It uses a distinctive terminology that instead of tools that help to illuminate what the structure looks like, and we'll look at some examples of a network. Terms like actors and ties are used to describe the participants and relationships in a network respectively. So actors become the individuals. They can also be organizations or teams of people, depending on how you're looking at networks. And the ties are just the relationships. It's literally, I am tied to you in our conversation. That can be a little bit of a turnoff, okay, for some people. This idea that I can quantify a human being. This is kind of a gray, fuzzy area in this research, and I think that it's actually very helpful because at some point we have to have real conversations about what work looks like. It doesn't mean that I'm turning somebody into this data point, but it is certainly giving me more information about a person than a simple survey. Actors are assumed in network analysis to be interdependent, and that their ties or lack of ties are pathways for resource and knowledge exchange, opportunity. It's just the only reason I'm here is because of a tie with Jacqueline, and that tie and my tie with my advisor. And all of a sudden my network exploded, okay, which is beneficial for me. And then we're doing research, which is beneficial for each other. And so this is the building of social capital and how it becomes kind of one of those, it can be serendipitous, that's real life, but it can also be an active thing that we do, where we actually go out and try to make connections with people. When modeled, these ties describe opportunities and constraints, and then these become data points. So there are specific terms then that describe what's happening in the network. We use the term of density to describe how clustered and how active a network is. So if there are a lot of pathways that people are talking together, that's a very dense network. If it's a group of people who meets maybe 2 times a year and exchanges information only 2 times a year, that's going to be a less dense network. There's going to be less exchange that way. We can talk about centralization, which is how knowledge is concentrated on one person or around one group of people within a network. There could be a kind of a key player in a network, somebody who holds a lot of knowledge, shares a lot of knowledge, and sometimes that can be very important for a network because they might be an expert that has very important information to share. Sometimes it can also be a point of congestion where perhaps that person is holding all of the knowledge and not letting it go. Maybe a lot of people come to me to learn about something, but I'm not going to other people to learn about them. So it can be not a reciprocal exchange. Sometimes people talk about centralization as popularity, not necessarily in a negative way, but just kind of in a practical way, that oftentimes the most central people in a network are the people that are friendliest, or maybe their desk is situated in an area that everybody walks by it. You know, so these ideas of proximity, location, also just my attitude, things like that can all impact what types of networks we're building and how we participate in them. And they're not stagnant, right? So our networks can change. So that's where looking at social network analysis, excuse me, can help us see, it can be almost used as an intervention in some respects, where we can take a look at our networks and see, well, is knowledge over here, you know, am I not learning much from the social psychologists, you know, and the counselors? Is really all of my knowledge based in education theory? And how can I pull people into my network? Or how could I go out to other networks to teach about what I know and to learn about what they know? We often naturally subgroup within a network. We're going to do that for our activity. It's very common for 2 or 3 people to work together more often than others, but they still are within a network. Those are important. Subgroups are very important because those are dynamic groups of exchange. You know how it's harder to work in large groups, but the work gets done smaller scale. The bad side of that, though, is that a lot of work can happen amongst a few people. So it's always a balance. There's no good network or bad work or network. It's always kind of evaluating, well, is this network right for what our goals are as a group? Homophily is when individuals bond with those that they are similar to. So it might be that most people who sit at lunch together, maybe most of the women sit together and most of the men go outside for a smoke. Who knows? But that is homophily. We go with like meets like. Oftentimes, those can be along gender lines, ethnicity, class, values, all of these very human qualities. And then this flow of knowledge can also correlate with the theoretical constructs in social capital, such as accountability, trust, cohesiveness, and shared vision. For example, homophily, am I only interacting with people that I trust because I have a long history with them? Maybe I've taught in the same school with them for many years. Or perhaps I am only sitting with or interacting with people where we have kind of a common view of the way I should be as a counselor, the way that I want to be as a counselor. And so on one hand, it's easy to talk to. It's easy to talk and exchange conversation with people that we're more alike with, but at the same time, you keep your knowledge very centralized into those relationships. There are very sophisticated programs developed to do social network analysis and to collect data from small groups. The teams I'm studying will be about 6 or 7 people, but these programs analyze networks that are millions of people. And that is called UCINet is one. And then also, if you go to the Wikipedia page looking at social network analysis software, it lists all of the different types of software that you can use. UCINet is basically free, which is a nice thing. It's kind of this, the analysis tools are open source for many people, so really any of us can do this, but it takes, there's a steep learning curve in trying to understand how. So there's a lot of, Henderine, for example, is a great resource for that, but there are courses and kind of extra courses that you can take to learn a little bit more about it. I've noticed that in the Netherlands there's more opportunity.
May I add?
Yeah.
I've given this relatiekaart and there it gives a link to de Universiteit Groningen. En die heeft een heel mooie handleiding voor. Dus daar zou je zo makkelijk tot je kunnen nemen.
Great.
Yeah.
So these are examples of social networks. This is a study that I've been involved with, which is looking at how educators cite each other in research. They're interprofessional researchers. The blue are psychologists. The green are social workers. The pink is a counselor, and then the orange are are teachers. And so I wanted to understand, when they write and create knowledge, are they doing this together? Are they actually pulling other people's research into what they do? And I found that yes, they're doing it a little bit, but they're really staying within their silos at the same time. So that's an example of what social network analysis can show. This was research about how teachers self-organize a project. So they were at a training, and these teachers, when they broke into groups, they organized themselves in the same school, same subject, and similar student body. So you had the same teachers working together in this training that always worked together. And that was just self-organization. This is a school that is integrating positive behavioral interventions school-wide. And this is a network analysis of all of the stakeholders involved in making that happen. And I think this is a good example of seeing how you have students represented on this map. You also have the PBIS, which is the intervention specialists. You have crisis specialists. You also have special education represented. And this represents the administration of the school. And so you can see how all of those players were involved in making this happen at this school. Now, in this particular study, they looked at 4 different schools and saw that some of the networks were really built just between the department chairs, the school administration, and the PBIS and the crisis teams. And it was less successful of an implementation. This implementation really reached across a much broader group of stakeholders. So that's another example. And then this is the last example, which maps nicely onto this idea of bonding, bridging, and linking social capital. So these groups, and I can't remember what these groups are but you have 3 teams within 2 organizations. And if we use an example, it's possible that this is maybe the parent-teacher or the parent organization, which we have in the U.S., kind of advocates, and then those could be the teachers, maybe subject groups. The link between Team A and Team B are bridging connections because they're reaching out of their own expertise, but the linking connections between these 2 groups are between the families, for example, and Organization A. So that shows how you can move laterally and vertically, longitudinally. So that's kind of a nice way to visualize how do these theories intersect. Examples in educational research of network analysis, some findings. That being a popular teacher is not always the best guide, the best choice to lead a community intervention. of really the person's strategic connection is to the most marginal people in a community, school, or workplace are better criteria. And so they had analyzed the entire system, community and school, and looked at and compared who somebody knew in the community versus how many people knew of somebody in the school. And the person who was most popular in the school knew less people in the community, if that makes sense. So their resources were really bound up in the school. And so the theory is that somebody who's less connected is going to do a little bit more work, who's less connected centrally in the school and more community-wide would make more of a difference. Many of you probably know, I can never say her first name. Nika Molinar. She looks at teacher collaboration networks often. Her findings on one study indicated that well-connected teacher networks were associated with strong teacher collective efficacy. So the more connected they were, the more they got done, essentially, and they were able to tie what the level of efficacy to student-level outcomes. This is a really important development in network analysis because it's difficult to make the step from how does our collaboration actually impact students down the road? Is it doing any good? Or is it just helping us get work done? But if the student is at the center, how is this working? So there's very few studies. Hers is one of them, and it's kind of exciting work. I'm using her as a model. And then this other one, where their findings indicated that teachers did not naturally build advice networks that would cultivate the highest levels of practitioner-based social capital. So essentially, teachers don't naturally, in this sample, go to the bridging and linking. That teachers really kind of stay within what they know. Some of this makes a lot of sense when you think about what we do on a day-to-day basis, but at the same time, being able to see this structurally can help move and shape how we develop curriculum for training for this idea of the networked teacher. This describes the non-networked teacher, essentially. So, what I want to do is give you an opportunity to draw your own ego networks. And we call it an ego network because you will be at the center of your network. The networks I showed you were complete networks where nobody was at the center, but we can't really do that practically. So you're going to draw your own networks. It's just an introduction to this idea of how we map and analyze in social network analysis. But this is how they did it from the beginning. All of the sophisticated software is based on people actually sitting down and drawing their own networks. So I'm going to give you a chance to draw your networks and then discuss it and kind of work with people to talk about what your networks look like. Did I see a hand?
Yes. Is it your professional network or also your private? Or?
This will be your professional network.
Okay.
Yeah, there will be more elaborate instructions. So you can get a bit bigger perspective. Hopefully, too, depending on your network, you'll be able to see how social capital is manifesting in those networks. And it's possible that this could maybe even be a teaching tool for your own students, just to be able to look at their networks as network teachers. You can do these for personal networks as well, but for this, I think it's best to go ahead and just say in the professional dimension. So what I want you to do while I hand you your materials is to think about something that you're involved in that's collaborative. Jacqueline had given some examples of writing and organizing a module. Any research groups or coaching a study group, are those collaborative endeavors normally?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, anything.
Could be anything.
Anything? Okay.
Being in the curriculum group or whatever.
Okay.
The team. Yeah, whatever.
It would be nice if those groups that you can think of have at least 10 to 15 connections. And if you're struggling with that, that's when the discussion will help, because it's possible that you might have overlooked a particular connection. So I'm going to show you an example of mine. So I mapped my dissertation committee network. This is what we're going to do. And that's me in the center. My dissertation is a little bit spread out between Ohio State University, Binghamton University, and then the group that I'm studying. So I'm in the middle. This is my dissertation team. These are my contacts for the study that I'm doing here. These are the teams of people that I'm studying. There were too many people to list, so I just listed them as individual entities. I have also listed, to give you a sense of what the macro level will be, the governing bodies that are shaping my dissertation, which is the internal review board that reviews all the research that I do. I'm being reviewed by 3 different review boards. So I have them listed because the school board is also involved. What I want you to do when you do this is also, on the little tabs that I'll give you, is to list the professions of the people they're training, so that you can get a sense of who you're collaborating with. For me, I'm collaborating almost exclusively with counselors and social workers, 1 public administrator. So my research is it's not really interdisciplinary. My research is really more multidisciplinary and somewhat siloed because of the perspectives that I'm getting. And I knew this, but it's good to see it and to recognize it. And then I was able to also kind of get a sense of where my micro, meso, and macro systems are coming into place. It's possible you won't have anything happen in the macro level on your network. But for me, I can see that I'm sharing a lot of knowledge with these pink lines, okay? Those are my direct connections with people. But there's a lot of knowledge shared between all of the people around me that's impacting what I am able to access and know, and those are the green lines. So there's knowledge exchange that I might not even be directly a part of, but it's filtering into how I'm able to form my research and articulate my research and collect my data. Does that make sense? Okay, it'll make more sense as you actually do it. Okay. So I have paper, pencils, markers for you. Okay, so I want you to divide up into groups of maybe 4 people. So maybe 10 groups. I have 10 different sets of markers. I have paper, Post-it notes, and pencils, and erasers and sharpeners. Okay? So what I want you to do first is grab supplies for each of you, and then these are the actual instructions, if you could circulate those. And I'll walk around and kind of help you with this a little bit too.